Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to wrap up our look at the beginning of English colonial system with the Massachusetts Bay Colonies and how these systems would grow, develop, and impact both the other colonies in the Americas as well as England back home. So let's get started. Initially, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a chartered colony, and the towns that are going to be set up are built around a church and a congregation. If you wanted to be involved in this political system, though, you had to be a member of the church. Land is distributed accordingly so that everyone who comes receives a set amount of land and also receives a certain amount of stuff on that land. Every house would have a garden and an orchard. Every farmland would have woods, pastures, and meadows. And all other land is held in common collectively together. And this would go on for quite some time. We don't see it even start to be divided up until the 1630s. Society continued to be dominated with men at the top and women having fewer rights, and in some cases, no rights at all. It is a strict patriarchy, and women were expected to be good wives, good mothers, and have children. This was one of the essential things in New England, the expectation to have a lot of kids, because the population in these towns, in these colonies, were initially very small. And yes, there are more people coming here, but establishing a presence intergenerationally is going to mean your family is a lot more authority in the region. Ultimately, we see people are going to live longer in the Massachusetts region than they will in the Chesapeake region because, number one, the climate is colder. There's fewer diseases like malaria or yellow fever that are going to spread in this area. Because people are living longer and having lots of kids, we see the role of grandparents in New England in ways that we didn't see elsewhere in the Americas and only kind of back in Europe anyways. Towns dominate the society. They ensured that schools were built accordingly. For every 50 families that were part of a town, a school was made. Now that school might be a primary school where children are learning how to read and write and count on their fingers, and then it might be ministries and colleges like Harvard, for example. There were plenty of problems that early Massachusetts saw. A lot of these towns were rather closer to a feudal state than they were a modern city. If you were in the upper echelons of society, you were like a landed lord back in England, and you could rule other people almost as if they were serfs. There was a definite class consciousness that existed, permeated through society, that the better people in society would be further closer to the front of the church. And this metaphor really did stay around for a long time. There was no role of democracy. There was no representative government. It was extremely discriminatory for a lot of reasons. It could be for social class, it could be for religion, it could be for style of dress, to name a few. You needed to be part of society, and society was dictated that everyone acts in this certain manner. Everyone fits into this certain mold. And if you didn't do that, then you were ostracized, you were kicked out, and that was just it. If you didn't like it, you were banished. And banishment meant that you were gone forever from that town. You usually though had some other people who are agreeing with you that, hey, we need to change this thing. I'm critical of this thing. So if you were banished, you and other like-minded folks would you just go and start a new colony somewhere else. This was really problematic and could not maintain itself for a long time. The Puritan ideology that existed did keep folks in line against a larger threat, against a larger fear. And this could have been the fear of the unknown, the fear of the devil. This could have been the fear of nature. But when all of society is united in this, yes, that unification can help, but without a larger thing to be fearful of, it started to fall apart. People in New England during this time believed that Big G God, Christian God, favored some people more than other people. This is going to sound a lot like social Darwinism, the idea that this person is in charge because they are believed to be special. The elect were those folks. They were those who were believed to have been touched by God, to receive God's blessing. And these were the members of the state, the members of the church who were supposed to stand above and rule in this way. And this is a real connection back to the divine rights of kings with an absolute monarchy, which we saw previously in Europe. The role of the state really is to control who can have a voice. People do get land, and it is varying based on how much you had bought in this model, in this company model that we had seen up until this point. And yeah. Over time, though, we see that the shareholders of the company leave England. They take their charter with them. When they arrive in the Americas, they create a larger government system that kind of mirrors what they had back in England. There's a two-house legislature, there's a governor, there is a judicial branch that is supposed to operate independent of both the legislative and the governor, very similar to what we see in today's political system. The consent of the governed is important for the Puritans. They wanted people to support this new system, but they didn't believe that all people are equal. Anyone was allowed to worship. Anyone is allowed to speak at the town hall meetings. But the investors, the elect, those are the people who actually get to make the decision. And initially, this was something that was easier to figure out. When you're in the wilderness, when you're establishing a civilization, a community for the first time, it might be easier to point out and say, okay, that guy really does have the blessing of the divine. Okay, that guy really does have it all going on. But as the civilization gets more complicated, as it gets more developed, as more people start coming in, pointing out who that person is when so many are living that way becomes much more difficult. New Englanders, Massachusetts Puritans believed that this social order was part of God's will. Collectively, they also didn't have a problem with slavery because there really wasn't slavery this far north. There was some, but never enough that it became a large thing. It was also believed that also be part of the ordeal. In this region, there is no religious toleration. And this doesn't mean the difference between Christianity and Islam or Judaism, Buddhism. No, we're even talking about specific branches of Protestantism is where religious toleration just does not exist. If you are practicing the wrong religion, if you are practicing the religion in a wrong way, then you are a heretic and the punishment is death. Despite that staggering concept, there is a division between church and state, though. The clergy could not hold elected office, and it was up to them to run the soul of a community, not run the physical community itself. A couple examples of individuals who were banished: Roger Williams, we'll get to him in just a few minutes, and Anne Hutchison. Both of them are banished. Hutchison pointed out some of the criticisms of the ministry and supported her argument with doctrine from theology, but even still, she was pointed at and said, no, you're gone, leave, and never return. And she did, and lots of people left with her. And when Williams pointed out that, maybe we should treat the Native Americans less terribly, he was banished for that as well. And people went with them in both of these times. The 1630s see the Great Migration, and this was a time where tens of thousands of Puritans start arriving into the Massachusetts Bay region. Infamously, this is when John Winthrop shows up. He brings with him the city upon a hill model. We're going to create a society which all others will look up to. John Endicott comes this time. He will be the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony on 6 different occasions. Salem and Boston will both be founded during this time. The Great Migration was the big push for this region to develop really, really fast in a lot of different ways. Roger Williams, and this is our depiction of him, he really changed things up when he said that it's not fair for us to take the land of Native Americans. He said that the role of government is not to regulate the religion, and that religions need to exist if man chooses them to exist. And as you can imagine, this did not sit so well with the Puritan leadership, and he was kicked out, where he would go on to form another colony. He establishes this new colony called Providence in 1636, and when it's done, it becomes Rhode Island. It gets an official charter in 44, and their big thing initially is total religious toleration and separation between church and state. They had an assembly of legislators that's elected twice a year, so every 6 months you have to run for office. So essentially you are constantly having to prove you deserve this job, and a new governor every year. Again, if you are not doing a good job, if you are not standing for the people, then in a couple of months you are out of work. You therefore have a lot of pressure to deliver. In that same year, as Rhode Island is established, we see that Connecticut is also established, this one by some Boston Puritans under Thomas Hooker. And they do this, they establish Connecticut because they felt that Massachusetts was just too arbitrary, it was too oppressive. You were not allowed to do your own will. You were not allowed to stand out for yourself. You had to fit into this specific mold. And then, 2 years after Hooker establishes Connecticut, New Haven is established by other Puritan separatists who say, no, we want more control. We want more authority in the state. And in 1660, these two colonies with surprisingly different belief systems and backgrounds actually unite together. And that's a thing. During this time, the fundamental orders of Connecticut are drafted and signed. This becomes the first constitution in American history. The idea that the government has to follow these guidelines. This is how the state will operate. The agreement between state and people. It said we're going to have representative democracy for all landowning men, not just church going, not just. And this map right here is really important to point out when we say where all this stuff kind of happened. You can see that these colonies are developing right on top of each other. And in some cases, they're relatively large, and in other cases, they're not. I mean, you can see here Rhode Island is depicted. That's the smallest state in the Union, to give an idea of how large or how small some of these states are by comparison to the Chesapeake region. Connecticut sees a conflict with the Native Americans, the Pequots, during this time as well. And the start of this conflict was because of a fur trader who was killed by the Pequots. And the New Englanders had not really trusted Native Americans much at all, and justified attacking the Pequot tribes in this year. The massacre of the Pequots would kill more than 500 Native Americans and enslave even more. The treaty that ultimately ended this and would make Native Americans no longer a threat in Connecticut at all would also decree that the name of the tribe was gone. And this concept was actually absent from history for a while, who the Pequots were. Over time, the colonists just took more and more of the native land and forced them off it. New England had a lot going on, to say the least. It was not just the place to go for religious persecution, or to flee religious persecution, to find your own way, to establish a new community. The quote for it was where religion and profit jump together. This region saw tons of fishing. They have some small-scale agriculture, but we're not seeing the big plantations that we will see in Virginia and farther south because it just gets too cold. You can survive yourself on your fish. You can survive yourself on your small family farms. And very importantly is timber. England had lost most of their standing pine forests, but they still existed here. And the large British warships, like you can see being built in that bottom picture, could require up to 100 trees. This meant if you are a carpenter, if you are a lumberjack, if you are skilled in this, then you are going to find profession and work and money very easily. A lot of these businesses we see follow the family trend. There's not as much indentured servant or slaves, partly because you need somebody who is skilled in that trade, not somebody who comes looking to have their trip paid for them. Trade very quickly becomes the basis of New England's economy, and they supply stuff to other colonies. Most infamously, they'd supply cod and pine to the West Indies. In exchange, the West Indies will sell them sugar and grown foodstuffs. The merchants will actually become the leaders of society in much the same way that political or church leaders had decades earlier. 30 years after the Great Migration, fewer and fewer individuals in New England were full church members in Massachusetts. And this was for some of these towns, this was really problematic because you had to be a full church member to govern the state and govern society. And if people aren't doing that, then your society is going to run out of people who can do things very quickly. The decision ultimately was made to increase church memberships, and said if you were a grandchild of somebody who came here, then you could receive full membership in the church, and you could potentially see your town continue to thrive and survive because of this. There were those people who said, we can't just award being church members willy-nilly. If we do that, some horrible disaster will come our way. But different groups in New England felt this was the problem they needed now, so they did. In England, at the close of the 17th century, there is a civil war. And the purpose of it is who has authority in the state. Is it Parliament or is it the king? There is some arguments over power. When it escalates very quickly because King Charles will say that Parliament itself was held in contempt and dissolved the entire parliamentary system in England. His goal was to rule England as an absolute monarch, to do as he saw fit without anyone underneath him. And there was his army and Parliament's army. It's no surprise to see that the average person was not super on board with this. Parliament's army is eventually victorious. The King of England was put on trial and beheaded, and Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the parliamentary army, is made Lord Protector, and he rules over England in a quasi-dictatorial manner for the rest of his life. With the monarchy essentially gone, and it will be gone until, again, Cromwell dies and Charles assumes the throne, some see this as a time that we can orchestrate a lot of big change. Some people said we needed to no longer see the church pay, or the state pay for the church. It was time to completely end religious persecution. It's time to do away with the monarchy. That last one was not super popular, but it did get people thinking. And when Charles II came to the throne, the role of the church in the state was changing, and the role of what an English person could be, see, do, have was also changing. Now, it's worth pointing out that at this time, this wasn't just affecting people living on the British Isles, it's affecting the colonists as well. Because even though they're separated from England by an ocean, they still see themselves as British citizens. And they're not members of a community, they're not members of the town as much as they are British people who just happen to be living in this new colony. Compared to other European nations, Englishmen had more rights. They had more freedoms. And lots of people saw what they were doing compared to how the French or how the Spanish had colonized as much more noble, as much less corrupt. The big changes that start to happen because of the English Civil War is, well, in Maryland, for example, Catholics are no longer going to remain exclusively in power. There are more and more Protestants who start coming in, and the Act of Toleration will grant religious freedom to all of them and expand to mean who can be in charge of different state functions. From its initial inception with Jamestown to the end of the English Civil War, we have seen the English colonies in the Americas radically transformed in a lot of different ways. Hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.